I'm glad he invited me to talk about data governance, no, privacy and security, because for me it's really a very interesting career path. And in fact, at the NPC, when I was the former deputy privacy commissioner, we had a goal, no, which was to make the Philippines a center of excellence. Now, we felt that Filipinos would really have a chance to shine in this profession and even be able to take uh, positions around the world, no? And I guess I would already be an example of that, holding a regional post, no, for a major multinational bank. I'd like to begin my presentation, with this article. I think that when you saw the invitation, it's a data is the new oil. That first came out in this magazine. I don't know how many of you read Wired magazine, but as far as I can tell, this is the first time that data being referred to as oil was actually came out in a major publication. Anyone want to guess what year this came out? No guesses in the chat?
Hold on, let me see. That's
Huh?
in the chat.
Oh,
I'm sorry, they can't see your slides. You haven't shared it yet.
I haven't shared. That's why. Okay.
That's why. So there's an article. Oh, there. Okay, let's see that now.
Uh,
2018. There you go. Note 8. Wait, let me look at the.
uh,
Hold on, let's
okay.
look at the chat.
So far, 2010,
2006,
2012.
1991.
Okay. And we got it. 2013. Yeah. Stella Benitez. Congratulations, Stella. Your guess was on the dot. So in 2013, Wired magazine called Data the new oil of the digital economy. And interestingly enough, The Economist echoed, the same headline, except it happened about 3 years later. Now, in May 2016, The Economist also. So I guess the message there is that nerds are a bit more ahead of economists in the information age. Now, why do they call data the new oil? No? Primarily, it's because of what this person, Giovanni Buttarelli, said. And that's that control of personal data can lead to control of a human being. And can you imagine how valuable that is, right? If you could control people's behaviors, what they buy, how they vote, how they should think. And just to give you a background, no, Giovanni is the tall person in the middle of the photo. He was the European Data Protection Supervisor. Unfortunately, he passed away in August last year, about a year ago. But he was still able to be a guest speaker at the Privacy Awareness Week. No? So some of you who recall PAW 2019, this was from Giovanni's speech. Control of personal data can lead to control of a human being. That's me beside him, by the way, and the other person to his right, or rather to his left, is Wojtek Wiewiórowski, who's currently the European Data Protection Supervisor. So, you think that's true? No, if someone has more data about you, they can actually control what you're going to think, what you're going to read, and how you're going to vote. I think the answer can even be found in a movie. No? It's called The Great Hack. It's a documentary about Cambridge Analytica and their role in several major political campaigns using data that was taken from Facebook. And I do encourage all of you who are listening today to watch this documentary. It's about an hour and a half. It can be found on Netflix, but it can be clearly seen how the paradigm is changing. No? Before we used to say, "What? I have nothing to hide. So why am I so concerned about data privacy?" But now that paradigm is shifting, right? The more you know about me, the more someone can control me. And in fact, the more they can harm me because they can do identity theft, leading to criminal or malicious activity. Right? So if you remember, you know, long time ago, they used to have what they call this subliminal messaging. You'd be watching a movie and then suddenly you'd feel the need to buy popcorn. It's because there was this message flashed on the screen so quickly, that it was called subliminal messaging. But nowadays, it's gone a step further. They call it micro targeting, and really it's aimed at manipulating your behavior using the data that you yourself have given up about you. And what sort of data is this that we're giving up? Well, the pandemic has actually unveiled us, by by allowing all this data to come out. What data is this? Before, if you wanted to know who I'm meeting or what movies I'm watching or what I'm eating, you'd have to follow me around and stalk me. Now, no need to stalk me anymore. Just look at Zoom to see who I'm meeting, Netflix, right, to see what I'm watching, Food Panda to know what I'm eating, Zalora to know what I'm buying, and my app called Flipboard to tell you what articles I've been reading. And so, in the past 6 months, more data has been collected, more data has been analyzed. No? And yes, no, John Marie is saying they also know what to recommend because once they have that data about you, yes, they can become the choice architect. And so this whole idea of nudging you, in fact, that's the title of the book, right? It's Nudge, came from the mind of this author, Richard Thaler. And Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize for his work on behavioral economics, which is all about how people can be nudged so they can make decisions about what to buy, how much to save, what food to select. No, and he calls this book, the subtitle is Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness. No? If you don't have time to read the book, then I recommend you go to YouTube. Just do a search on Nudge and Richard Thaler, and you will see dozens of videos, literally. But you select the ones that Richard Thaler himself has made. No? And they're short videos, 5-minute videos, 10-minute videos. And he will really show you how uh, your decision making can be manipulated, can be nudged in certain ways without you even being aware, that you're being nudged. Now, that can of course have scary, in fact, contradictory, sorry, connotations. No? So, what I'd like to draw your attention to is his co-author. As you can see there, the co-author is a person named Cass Sunstein. And Richard Thaler, while he was an economics professor at Chicago, Cass Sunstein was a law professor, and he co-authored this book. And he became quite disturbed by the implications, of behavioral manipulation. So he came up with a book of his own, called The Ethics of Influence. Because truly enough, when you're influencing someone, you have to be aware of your ethical motivations for that. So Cass Sunstein wrote this book. Again, if you're more of a YouTube person, you can also type in Cass Sunstein into YouTube, and you'll see that he has several videos, a bit longer, 45 minutes, 60 minutes, but at least you'll be able to get a sense of what this ethical framework is. When you're nudging someone, when you're influencing someone, how do you know, right, whether your motivations are proper and good and moral? So what I'll do is I'll pause there, because I guess because of this medium that you're in, I cannot see your faces. I don't know if I have your attention, right? And so once in a while, I'd like to pause just to see what's in the Q&A, what's in the chat, and maybe JJ, you can also let me know, right, if there's anything any questions there that I can address.
Well, I'm seeing uh, recommendations for the great hack. There are questions on, hold on. Well, they were asking more of more of the standard questions on how to call this. I'm sorry. Um, Certification. I think that's one of the questions that we're seeing here. Let me see. Maybe we'll no question now, Sabi. No question right now, but excited to move along.
Yeah, yeah. I do see some questions about speaker notes. Yes, no, I've
Oh
provided
yes,
JJ
that's right.
with a PDF file, no, which he can forward to you.
Yes.
Um, I also want to address right away, the question about certification. Yes, there are quite a lot of certifications being offered. One of them is from the NADPAP. That's the National Association of DPOs in the Philippines. So you can go to the NADPAP page on Facebook, NADPOP. And I know that JJ is actually also working with the NADPOP officers, to come up with a certification.
That's right.
Here is something though that you have to consider. The law is being amended, no, as we speak. There's a TWG in Congress that's coming up with amendments to the law. Therefore, if you have a certification on the Philippine Privacy Act, what happens to that certification if 6 months from now, 12 months from now, an amended version of the law is passed? And by the way, there are quite a few major amendments, like there will be fines, uh, administrative fines. So maybe that's something that you need to think about. No, is if you take a certification now, will you be allowed to take a refresher certification so that you don't have to take the whole exam? You can just take the questions related to the amendments, no, in the law. Sige, other questions? There's some questions related to
Oh,
the, I think, the best addressed by the NPC. Unfortunately, we don't have anyone from the NPC, and unless JJ, you have someone hidden
I don't
there.
know. No, I don't have anyone. There's a question here about school administrators dropping by during online classes to monitor the classes. Are there privacy parameters on this?
It's simply just like the classroom, right? The
Hmm,
DepEd has given school administrators custodial responsibilities, no? And so of course they have to carry those out. So just like with we have a framework of laws, some related to healthcare, some related to education, and so you cannot, of course, just take the Data Privacy Act in a vacuum, no, and say that, hey, all of these other things no longer apply. No, you have to look at the bills the laws related to education and the administration of education, to realize that again, they have that custodial responsibility. Now, of course, you might say that applies if they're on the campus, right? But will that also apply uh, online in the virtual world? Well, why not, right? Because it's a virtual classroom.
makes sense. Makes sense. Uh, you want to go over some of the questions now?
Sure,
How to formulate privacy management program and privacy impact assessment. This is a very timely
okay,
question.
yeah, those will cover. We will cover those.
Okay,
Yeah,
we'll cover later.
yeah.
How to
Eh,
decide as a person on how much personal data we should give at a certain situation. This is interesting. Sorry, I'll read it in
yeah.
full. Do you have a suggestion on how we can decide as a person how much data we should give at a certain situation?
Yeah. One of the sayings that I came up with is that privacy is the proxy for trust, right? Because you have to know who to trust, and to what extent, right, before you reveal all this data, and remove the shield of privacy. So there are certain things that you can see to develop that trust. One of them, of course, is a privacy notice. No, does this company that's collecting data from you, give you a privacy notice and tell you clearly what they'll be using that data for, how long they will be keeping it, who they'll be sharing it, and how they're securing it. Another thing that I look for is data protection officer. Usually there's a note somewhere on the screen or in the website or in the application form that says, if you have any questions or complaints, talk to this person. He or she is our data protection officer. Other things I would look for would include certifications. Uh, ISO 27701, 27701 is one certification which says that this company has put in place a protocol, no, a policy and procedures on how to manage the information that's been entrusted to them. Another certification is called the CBPR, Cross-Border Privacy Rule Certification. So APEC accountability agents would give that certification, which basically says that the company that has that certification can be entrusted with data, and even if they transfer data across borders, they will keep it safe and secure and private. So hopefully that gives you some idea, of who to trust really with the data. Yeah, with your personal data. So maybe another tip would be give a little at a time, and if what you've given has not been protected, has not been secured, then don't give them anymore. In fact, erase the app. Maybe take it off from your phone.
That's right. Sometimes it's hard to control, no? When you give your consent uh, on the ano. There's an interesting question here. What's the difference between a data privacy notice and a data privacy policy? From Darwin De Luna.
Yeah. Okay. I don't have the slide which says that, right? But look at it as the two sides of a coin. The notice is what you present to the data subject, and that's why we often call that the external policy. The internal policy, what you show to your employees, has to be a reflection. So if your notice says, I will collect, your cell phone, your name, your address, the collection policy should also say the same thing, because they should be mirror images. If your data privacy notice says, I will keep your data for 5 years, then your disposal policy should say, any data that's older than 5 years, we have to dispose of. Again, because they have to be consistent with each other. Now, so sometimes you'll hear the term external policy for the data privacy notice and internal policy for the manuals, the procedures, and so on. Okay, so maybe let's move on. But this is good, no? Because like I said, I don't want to keep talking, and everyone's already falling asleep. So I will pause at certain portions, no, to check if everyone's awake and to get questions. So because data is the new oil, no, because it's so important and it can be used to harm people and manipulate their behavior, governments around the world have passed all sorts of data privacy legislation. No, and you can see this is a map from the IAPP website, the International Association of Privacy Professionals, which is another organization that I represent. Uh, Many countries have passed laws. The ones in blue, which include the Philippines, already have omnibus laws. Other countries that are in orange are in the process of passing or drafting these laws. And the circle that I've drawn, that's the area that I'm responsible for, Asia Pacific. It's got about 17 different countries, um, multiple time zones, many different languages and dialects. And so those are some of the challenges that I face as a regional DPO, having to keep track, of what are all the new sorts of laws that are coming up. Uh, just to contrast it, with someone who's my counterpart, let's say in Europe, uh, my counterpart there would be handling the GDPR countries. So that may cover, about 28, 29 countries, but at least they all have one law, right? And so there are some benefits, to just having one law for several countries. Of course, in Asia Pacific, we're trying to at least come up with what we call common standards. No? So I think I mentioned APEC, CBPR as one common standard. ASEAN is also coming up with a data framework. No? So with all these laws, that has given rise to a new career, and that's the career of the privacy professional. So again, this is an article that came out some years ago, probably 2017, 2018, where they actually said that the DPO is the hottest tech ticket in town. So it's a job that hundreds of thousands, literally hundreds of thousands have now switched their careers now to becoming DPOs. And we know that because there have been registration and certifications. No? In the EU, for example, because of their law called the GDPR, there are close to 400,000 that have now registered. In the Philippines, we have, I think, about 25,000 registered DPOs. And the numbers are quite similar, in other countries. Now, I think we also saw, JJ, that we have some small companies here as well as large companies. I just want to let you know, I can empathize with you, because in the 17 countries that I handle, some of those countries we have less than 30 employees. So that's basically small. In some we have 100 employees. In some we have 5,000 employees, and in the larger countries we have close to 50,000 employees. No? So just within APAC, there's a wide variety. And I do have DPOs. No? So each of these countries would also have their own DPO reporting into the regional office, and our regions, of course, report into the global, right? But I can also empathize with some of you, attending today with regard to the size of the company. Don't think that just because I'm talking from the perspective of a large multinational, that that's the only experience that I have. I can really empathize with the smaller companies, 10, 15 employees, and I know how difficult it is, to implement some of these practices. To find out more, about really how to be a DPO and what are the roles and responsibilities, there's no better place than to go to the law itself. No, the Data Privacy Act, Section 21B, which is echoed in the IRR Section 50B, says that each uh, organization that handles personal data must appoint an individual, or it can be several non-individuals who are accountable for the organization's compliance with this act. Right? And again, the key word there is accountable. As a DPO, you're not going to be there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to look at each and every form that's being collected, right? But and so it's really those persons at the front lines, the ones who are handling the data, who could be put in jail. No, but the accountability means at least you're there to train them, to show them the right way. And the only time really that a DPO should go to jail is if they themselves commit a criminal act or if there's gross negligence. But most of the time, I think what we're really seeing is that a lot of the violations are happening not at the level of the DPO, but they're happening at the front lines. There's a clerk, who forgot to do something. There's a security guard, who was unable to perform the duty, and so there was a data breach. There's somebody who forgot to lock the door, so on and so forth. There's a webmaster who put some data, on the website, right? So, but I think in most of the cases, no, at least those that I handled when I was there at the NPC, it was not the DPO, no, who was at fault. It's not the DPO who would go to jail, no, if ever. Okay. Uh, and then of course the advisory. This is about a 10-page advisory, which is expands this one line in the law. Is called Advisory 2017-01. Again, you can download it from the NPC website. And I do recommend, though, that you look at this if you're interested in becoming a DPO and pursuing a career, in the privacy profession. So what's a DPO? Again, someone who's accountable for compliance. And so what I'd like to do is for the rest of this 1 hour or so, is to really talk about the different aspects of compliance. Again, like I said, I'll show 2 to 3 slides. Then we'll talk about the first bullet point, then we'll stop for questions. Go to the second one and we'll stop for questions. Hopefully also that avoids, when sometimes you ask a question at the end and I don't even remember anymore what slide you were referring to. So as much as possible, no, please ask the questions while the slide is still fresh in our minds. So let's talk about the first one, no? Paper compliance versus operational compliance. Where did this term come from? Well, it's there in the circular 1802, which is called Guidelines on Compliance Checks. And in this circular, the NPC says there are 3 types of compliance checks that they can do. One is called the privacy sweep, where they will just look at your website and look at the forms and posters around without even telling you that they're there. The second one is called the document submission. And the document submission, that's where they'll send you a letter and ask you to submit certain documents like your privacy notice, your manuals, your PIA, and so on. The third type of compliance check is the on-site visit, where they'll actually visit your premises, interview your employees, uh, maybe even look at your uh, physical, technical, and organizational controls for securing data. So those are the 3 types of compliance checks. No? And paper compliance is one way to address the privacy sweep and the document submission, because really it's more of a desktop exercise. No? Of course, this will help you mitigate legal consequences such as penalties, compliance orders, and lawsuits. And in order to pass, paper compliance, what do you need? You have to have your documents always up to date, and your document should always be synchronized. Like I said, consistency. No, if in your privacy notice it says, "I will share your data with companies A, B, and C," then you should also have data sharing agreements with A, B, and C. If your privacy notice says, "I will share your data with A, B, and C," then when the NPC comes, you can only show data sharing agreements with A and B. Already, you're not in compliance. No? Already, your documentation is out of date. No? So that's why it's very important, of course, to have paper compliance. But paper compliance is not enough. It has to be aligned with how the people are behaving, how your employees, how your frontliners are behaving. Right? So operational compliance means that employee behavior is aligned with all those nice policies, all those nice manuals and procedures that you have. No, as one of the company presidents told me, right? He said, we need to move to what he calls a zero breach mindset. Because, when it comes to data privacy, one person's misconduct can tarnish the entire organization, right? So you really have to make sure that you've trained everyone, you've conducted audits and inspections, so that they don't make this silly mistake, which tarnishes and brings everyone at risk. So that's what organizational compliance is all about. It addresses customer scrutiny, because it's really the customers that are looking, with eagle eyes towards all these things happening with the data that you collect from them. It will also help you to meet the on-site visit. Remember, that's the third mode of the compliance check that I talked about. And so operational compliance helps you mitigate operational risk. Things like cyber criminals, hackers, right? Things like earthquakes, fires, which would cause loss of data. So all these things can result in business disruption, right? Costs to bring back and build that data. So that's what we call remediation costs. Customers leaving, because of your data breaches, your lost reputation. So all of those are what we call the real world consequences and your operational risks. And all the best policies and manuals in the world will not be able to prevent that from happening. The only thing that can prevent that from happening is operational compliance, which means your employees are behaving, in alignment with your data privacy policies and procedures. So that's not easy to do, right? That entails a lot of what we call culture change. It requires building a culture of privacy through a variety of plans and programs. It's not a one-time thing where you conduct training and then you expect them to remember it. No, you have to have posters, you have to have reminders when they log on. There are these pop-ups. I remember, before the pandemic, I would visit some banks, and I would see even in the elevators, in the bulletin boards, there would be all these kinds of reminders, helping to build that culture of privacy. Okay. So now, when we did the PIA, the result of your privacy impact assessment is to tell you what risks there are in that process. And this is why risk appetite is important. And I'll tell you one sentence description, which I will then explain on the next slide. Risk appetite is the ability to accept the difference between risk exposure and your capacity to manage risk, right? So are you willing to accept that difference? And I'll give you the example now. Here is a nice juicy burger, right? So many calories, right? And if you're gonna eat it, you know what? That you're at the risk of indigestion, right? But some people are willing to take that risk. Like this guy here, his capacity to digest that, he's confident of his capacity, right? So he says, "Yes, I'm gonna eat that." But this other guy comes up and he's wondering, "Kaya ko ba yan? Can I actually, finish that, without running the risk of indigestion?" But he says, but my appetite is big. So you get the point, right? So even if there's a difference between the risk and your capacity, your appetite can make up the difference. And so companies that have a high appetite for risk are willing to take on these risky processes. Whereas usually regulated companies that are allergic to risk will say no, unless we are confident of our capacity to manage that risk, then we will shy away because our risk appetite is zero. Right? Whereas other companies will say our risk appetite is 1 or 2 or 3. Okay. Now, just because your capacity to handle risk is low, does that mean you'll have to walk away from a lot of these risky processes? Not necessarily, right? Because there are always ways to increase your risk management capacity. So, for example, you're not sure whether you can handle the risk, of the process that you're now considering. One way to increase your capability is to bring in reinforcements. Now you can say, I'm at the national level, I can bring in someone from the regional level. And so as the regional DPO, that's what I'm prepared to do. No, I'm prepared to help out sometimes, at these different countries. Of course, as regional DPO, you also have to make sure that you're aware of your resources because at some point, you might be running out and you can't help those countries that need additional help. So it's also a good idea to think of another way, which is to bring in outsources or service providers, right? And so here we often say that you can share the risk with them, but you don't transfer the risk. Now, of course, this comes at an additional cost. Uh, and so you have to also assess the additional risk of transferring your data to that third party or to that service provider. So these are what we call the second order risks. You did your first risk assessment, you're bringing in a service provider, you now have to assess the additional risk. And so oftentimes the answer to increasing capability is investing in yourself, right? Building your own capabilities so that you can handle those risks. And this could mean additional training for your staff, additional certification, investing in new technology, new software, so that your staff can now take advantage of what we call these privacy enhancing technologies or PATs. It can be something as simple as redesigning a form, redesigning a screen or a report, right? So that your risk exposure is lowered. Okay, so just wanted to very quickly go over that uh, concept, of risk management, risk appetite. But very quickly also, let me go on to the next slide, which says these are often times where you have board confrontations or disagreements. Because remember the picture we had earlier, the process owner, the COP, the DPO, they will oftentimes have these disagreements. The process owner will say it's low risk. The DPO will say it's high risk, right? And so there's a disagreement on what exactly our risk exposure is. Or there's a disagreement on capability to manage risk, right? The COP will say, kaya namin yan, we can manage that risk. The DPO will say, no, I don't think you're able to manage that risk. And so, even if they work these out, the final question when you get to the board or to the Mancom executive committee is, so how much do you need? If we're going to invest in service providers, right, outsourcing, if we're going to invest in capabilities to bring up your ability to manage that risk, how much will it cost, right? So oftentimes these are where you have those types of discussions. No? Now, some of my tips here, uh, when we talk about risk exposure, this is where it helps to have a discipline, a risk management discipline. Some of you may even have heard of ISO 31,000. No, it's a whole book that talks about different types of risks. But just to simplify it, for example, in your organization, you might talk about compliance risk, financial risk, right, market risk, reputational risk, operational risk, environmental risk, right? So these are the types of uh, dimensions of risk. And you may have one, two, or three, but the idea is to have a taxonomy. So when you talk about risks, you agree with each other, right? Then remember the risk appetite. You can even have a different risk appetite for each one. Like we have a healthy appetite for financial risk, but we have zero appetite for compliance risk. You know, that might be an example of how you talk. And last but not least, when you talk about risk, you oftentimes have an XY matrix. No? And if you look at the documentation from the NPC, if you look at the exhibits attached in the back, they all have an example of a 4 by 4 matrix where you rate on one axis the impact of the exposure and on another axis the likelihood or probability. And this comes up, this results in a 4 by 4 matrix where you can now easily say, ito malala, mataas yung impact pero low probability. Or something that's high impact and high probability, and obviously that would be high risk. So by having these tools, by having these terminologies, it reduces the disagreements that you have over risk exposure. Because that's one of the hardest things to resolve. No? If the process owner says, oh, low risk ito, but the DPO says high risk, now, how do you get them to an agreement? Okay. So that's one area you need to manage. The other one is the investment. No, and oftentimes you go to the board, you say, I need 100,000 pesos to do this. No, and the process owner and the DPO both agree that it's 100,000. Then the board says we can only give you 50,000. What do you do? No, and so here it helps to do what's called scenario planning. No, what if you're only given 50,000? What can you do? What if you have more? What can you do with it? What if you have this much? What can you do with it, right? So at least you're prepared for scenario A, B, or C. Uh, the one in the middle that talks about capability to manage risk. This one can also get medyo sensitive pa nga dyan, because someone will say, kaya ko yan. And then you have to come back and say, hindi mo kaya yan. No? Yung kakayahan niya, yung kapabilidad niya, na gawin yung proseso na yon. So, uh, the best way to resolve this for me is to look at industry benchmarks or standards. No? I think I mentioned a couple already earlier, right? The question really here is, here's a scorecard that was developed by the industry. In the case of ISO, um, many private sector organizations, developed that. In the case of the CBPR, cross-border privacy rules, the APEC members that came together, and here you would be asked to answer certain questions. Again, rate yourself. Are you really keeping track of all the technologies out there to see, what the exposure each one can give you? Do you have a good idea of where your data is? Have you mapped it? And do you have an inventory of where it's located? Do you have procedures in place for cross-border transfers? Do you have incident reporting and breach management processes in place? Do you know how many of your employees are trained? No, and how often do they have a refresher? When was the last time you did an audit? When was the last time you did a vulnerability assessment? When was the last time you did a drill? No, and these benchmarks allow you to rate yourself against how the rest of the industry is doing. So when it comes time to kaya ba natin yan o hindi natin kaya, there's an objective way of measuring that, right? So at least you can point to these checklists. You don't necessarily have to get the seal of approval, no, because people ask me, magkano ba yan? No, it's expensive to get an ISO stamp, right? It's there on your logo, it's there in your letterhead, etc. But even without getting that stamp of approval, just to use the checklist to do an internal self-assessment is already oftentimes a useful exercise. No? But once you've done this, once you've done all of it, of course, why not? Why not get that ribbon? No, why not get that seal? Because as we mentioned at the beginning of the session, how will people know that you can be trusted? How will the data subjects know that they can give the data to you? And one way is by having these certifications, whether it be from ISO or APEC or, what other uh, organizations,